On the social front this year were a number of unfortunate events, including the Halloween tragedy in Itaewon that stunned the nation and the Kakao service disruption that brought daily life to a halt here. So what have been the post-Itaewon measures thus far? What legal framework can serve to better address social disruptions? And is digital detox a New Year's health resolution in 2023? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we highlight some of the stories that made headlines in the social arena this year. And for that I have Professor Shin Eun Kyong from Korea University. Professor Shin, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
I also have Professor Cho Hee-kyung at Hongik University live on the line. Professor Cho, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Shin, we'll start here in the studio then. Let's begin with the Halloween tragedy that not only put on tragic display Korea's failings in its safety regulations and more, and also it had some appalling animosity online targeting victims and their family members. Can you explain this unfortunate social phenomenon for us?
Two factors can be considered. So online social media communication has been extremely polarized. Echo chambers and filter bubble can exacerbate online hate speech. Of course, not everyone posts their thoughts online, but some do. And those digital dialogues may not be representative of the general sentiment, yet the majority of people are exposed to them and heavily influenced by them. So the momentary ventilation of anger or frustration can, once they're mounted in the digital space, they're permanently engraved. And then it could cascade into another social disaster. I do believe in freedom of speech, yet it does not mean that we have a right to insert other people, whether online, offline, with their or not. Then, why hatred? The hostility against the victims that revealed our limited understanding of the people who may seem foreign to one's ego's perspective. In fact, we are already living in an extremely heterogeneous society, and far more so than it appears on the surface. Yet we may have not had the opportunity to develop mature attitude to accept such diversity. So in a nutshell, we can say that the distinctive characteristic of online communication and lack of understanding of diversity that escalated into such animosity after the tragedy.
Right, unfortunately, of course. Professor Cho, staying with the Itaewon crowd crush, and generally speaking then, how do you evaluate Korea's post-tragedy measures thus far?
I would say that the measures taken thus far, post-tragedy in Itaewon, have been rather unsatisfactory to most people, particularly to the families of the victims of the tragedy. So currently there is a police investigation that's ongoing, looking at who's actually responsible for the disaster. And just yesterday, we had the chief of Yongsan District Council taken into custody, along with the team leader of the Disaster Management Center in Yongsan. And so they are the first arrests that are actually made in the case. I understand that an arrest warrant is soon to be issued for the fire station chief, whom we actually saw briefing the reporters on the scene, and many people had applauded his efforts on the night. But the question had always been that because this police investigation is being conducted by the police themselves, whether there is going to be a fair investigation made into the main authority who's actually responsible for crowd control that night, which is the police. And so there's a big question mark. Separately, there is the National Commission, which has launched an inquiry into what actually happened. So this is separate from the criminal investigation. And again, there was so much politicization of the commission and launching it and trying to link it to passing of the budget, and eventually just the opposition parties have agreed and are cooperating to conduct the commission inquiry. And so I would say the measures have been somewhat slow off the mark and somewhat half-hearted thus far, and on the whole unsatisfactory.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Professor Shin, some say that Korea has been inured to crowds regardless of their density over the years. Now, do you believe the Itaewon incident is perhaps now changing our mentality with regard to crowds and crowd safety?
I hope so. The crowdedness is not a mere inconvenience. It is a failure of planning. We have been insensitive to the crowdedness despite of our extreme density, as we all know, just like traffic congestion. So we know that subways during this rush hours are suffocating, but we didn't do much about it. Now this tragedy forced us to see the inherent danger in the crowdedness. And I hope the current discussion allow to have fruitful conversation to deal with this chronic congestion in our society. And also, the crowdedness in Korea is not a simple product of intense population density. Of course, Seoul is the most densely populated city amongst the OECD capital cities, yet the uniqueness of Korean population density is in its skewness. So we have very uneven distribution of population, which is caused by a disproportionate distribution of resources. It could be cultural infrastructure, social infrastructures are condensed very exclusively to specific spots. So when we design the future, I think we need to consider that we shouldn't be neglected the macro level causes of this cloudiness in the society.
Right, there is much to be considered then. And Professor Cho, what are some of the possible legal tasks that this particular tragedy has left to be tackled?
Initially, there were a lot of red herrings being thrown about. People arguing that, well, because this was not an organized event, there was no central authority that was responsible for crowd management, etc. We know that to be just, pulling wool over our eyes, or trying to, because there are already Framework Act on Disaster and Safety Management law, and there's the Police Act and Duties of Police Officers Act that gave plenty of legal grounds for responsible actors and authorities to take action on that night. What are some lacuna that we actually see in the legal framework is that, we have a Good Samaritan law. So there were on the night people who wanted to help the victims, but who felt they might be responsible for if something went wrong afterwards, and so they were reluctant to do so. Our current Good Samaritan law, there is a sort of an exemption of liability on people if something does go wrong, but there is no obligation on people to help. So if we compare example of Germany, they actually make it mandatory when you get your driver's license to receive CPR training. So everyone who has a driver's license is equipped to provide CPR. And they also make it a legal obligation to help people when they are in emergency situation like this. And so something like that, I think, is needed. Professor Shin referred earlier to defaming of victims online. We have defamation law that actually protect the dead under our current criminal code, but there was also privacy issues of victims as well as victims' families that were really sort of seriously infringed online. So I think we need to consider that as well. And some lawmakers have proposed a kind of framework on basic sort of life and safety law, not just disaster management. And so those are the kind of laws that we need to consider, as well as confidentiality about victims and their families.
Right, of course. Moving forward, Professor Shin, also in the month of October, we saw daily life come to an almost halt following a fire at a data center of Kakao. What were the social implications of this tremendous disruption?
1015 Kakao disaster was actually manifested how a local simple event can lead to a nationwide disaster, if not global. So when we learn, what we learned, the most importantly is that the disaster show us the influence that affects us differently. Some were able to manage to do their work regardlessly, and some were not, especially for those small business owners who run their business through subscription of the platform. They were not well protected. So ironically, this disaster enabled us to detect who were the most vulnerable population in a digital society. And also from the network perspective, it turned out that we were heavily relying on extremely fragile network structure. Exclusive dependency on one platform led to highly centralized network structure. And that could be very efficient, and which also sometimes allowed fast growing of the company. Yet when there is perturbation, external perturbation, modular structure is more resilient. Putting this into English, we need to have diversified the network structure, which means allowing multiple hubs in its network, so which can prevent catastrophe, similar catastrophe in the future.
Right, and talking about preventing similar catastrophe in the future, I hear the Kakao disruption, Professor Cho, also brought to light the importance of a tangible legal safety net, if I may, to better promote platform security. Do you care to explain?
Well, essentially, those kind of services that are considered to be essential to our lives, they are made part of like a national disaster planning, and there is legal responsibility or liability placed on operators of those services to make sure that they have redundancy in their services, resilience built into their services, and plans for proper backup, which Kakao didn't have because they are not classified as a core service. In terms of telecommunications, only telephone calls and fax services are currently defined as core services. And because Kakao, with their messaging and other platform services, are categorized as non-core, they didn't actually have a real sort of legal liability, even if they had very shoddy, unreliable backup plans. And I was personally shocked at that a company so big as Kakao was able to actually have, get away with having such flimsy kind of backup, plans. Professor Shin just mentioned about resilience and diversified services. And the gold standard would be a total duplication of their hardware and real-time data replication, but that's just too expensive. So this is why Kakao didn't go that way. But Naver, who suffered the same kind of outage, were able to have their services back up online almost within the same day, whereas it took more than 4 days for Kakao. So, in fact, I read news this morning that they have passed a law which does now include Kakao, even though it's a non-core service. It doesn't actually name Kakao as such, but the kind of service that Kakao provides into core service so that there will be legal liability on that kind of platform to make sure that they have proper backup services.
Right, of course. Professor Shin, in contrast to the discomfort of the disruption for most, some spoke of having had a delightful experience of digital detox. And that being said, do you see digital detox perhaps as becoming a New Year's health resolution in the year 2023? How necessary is it for us in modern society?
Actually, that was very interesting social quasi-experiment. As a collective, we experienced a momentary detox, digital detox, together. And ironically, it revealed how toxic the digital communication was and unfortunately is. But the thing is, we constantly live with the pressure, that immediate response, and also the temporal escape from the pressure was certainly enjoyable. Yet, when we are not receiving emergency-coded work-related message through Kakao or constant threat of advertisement, of course, it ripped pressure from us, but at the same time made us question, was it really necessary, that much connectivity? So it actually provided really important thought points there. But most of us cannot live without this connection, obviously. And the most pressing task for us is not about digital detox, which is temporal escape from those toxicity from digital space. Yet the most challenging task is to how to purify the digital space. Not detox from digital space, but detox of the digital space is necessary. I think that should be our collective New Year's resolution.
Nice, so to make it a more productive space of interaction then. All right, Professor Shin, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Cho, thank you very much for your insights as always.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have today. We return tomorrow. That is Wednesday, same time, with the latest on the pandemic this year. Thank you for now.